Good morning, all. Welcome. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this very important topic. I do see that folks are trickling in. So, there is a lot to cover. So I do want to get us started, but just to give folks a little bit of time as we are waiting for individuals to log in and join us, I certainly invite you to share your name, your role, and where you are joining us from, just so we kind of get a sense of, who's on the line with us today. And if you get a chance, what is it about this webinar that called your attention? What was of interest to you? Because we do certainly appreciate your attendance here. So again, if you get a chance, your name, your role, and what was interesting about this webinar, we'd love to hear that from you. So please do that in the chat box. And again, as we are waiting for folks to come in, I'm just going to handle some of the logistics. So my name is Diana Arias. I'm with the Community Technical Assistance Center at NYU's McSilver Institute. And again, I would like to welcome you to A Mental Health Moment, a conversation about environmental racism and youth mental health with Matthew Mills and Angeline Padilla, moderated by Leslie Giglio. So before we get started, I want to take a moment to orient everyone so you know how to participate in today's event. Upon joining the webinar, you have been placed on mute to avoid any background noise and may distract others from listening to the presentation. If you come across any technical issues during today's event, please chat to the CTEC host who will be able to assist you. If you would like to activate closed captions, you can do so by clicking on the toolbar button that says live transcripts, and then you can select show subtitles. At the end of today's presentation, we do have a short feedback survey, and we would appreciate you completing it. Your feedback and suggestions do help to inform our future offerings. And lastly, the recording and slides for this presentation will be posted on our CTEC website, ctecny.org, within the next 2 to 3 days. As I'm seeing folks chat in, thank you so much. Folks are looking to gain some knowledge. We have folks, it seems, from different roles as well, social workers, licensed folks, upstate, downstate as well. So thank you all so much for joining. At this moment, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Diana. And good morning, everyone. Thank you again for joining this important conversation. And before we get to our incredible panel discussion with Matthew and Evangeline, I want to spend first a little bit of time just giving a really high-level overview of the intersection of climate change, environmental racism, and youth mental health. And so climate change is already and is going to continue to be really one of the leading global issues, health issues, and mental health issues specifically of this coming generation. But a lot of the general focus in the literature in this space has really been sort of around the biomedical impacts. So the medical things, the physical symptoms, but less so on, again, that mental health impact. And so there has been a little bit of kind of recent literature in this space, particularly some APA reports and some really important Lancet studies that are really focusing on sort of the eco-stress and anxiety piece, which we'll be touching on a little bit later, but again, really lacking in that space between environmental racism and mental health, and that'll be kind of the focus of the discussion. So to really understand that, first, climate change is ultimately going to impact all of our lives, but it is especially the low-income, historically marginalized communities that are going to be most impacted, both in the immediate event of a natural climate disasters, but also in sort of that long-term recovery piece. And this is due to environmental racism, which in the context of the US, we're going to be focusing on is any policy, practice, or directive that differentially affects or disadvantages, whether intended or unintended, individuals, groups, or communities based on their race. And one of the most infamous sort of examples of this is redlining, which, if you're not familiar, was a practice of outlining predominantly white communities as desirable on a physical map, whereas Black and Brown communities were outlined in red and yellow, indicating that those were less desirable communities. And this practice really barred communities in these redline areas from receiving home loans. And that's really when you begin to see sort of this divide in intergenerational wealth and also that wealth accumulation over time. And so over multiple decades, these same redline communities have been disinvested in, and you're also seeing a huge level of just exacerbated poverty and mental health outcomes in these same places. So to give a visual of what that looks like on a map, so On the left-hand side, this is a map of San Francisco, redlining map from the 1940s. You can very clearly see the areas that are colored in red, also yellow, again, indicating that they were less desirable. Most often, Black and brown communities live and also currently live there today. And so if you kind of pan to the upper right-hand map in the orange, the dark orange areas, again, you're seeing those same exact communities. And this is showing poverty concentrations today in the present moment in San Francisco. And lastly, in the bottom right, in the purple, this is asthma-related emergency room visits in San Francisco. So really thinking about those same communities today that were redlined, you can very clearly see that overlay on the maps. And also for this purple map, these Black and brown communities have the highest proximity to freeways, toxic dumping sites, and a lot of factories within the city. Okay, and so thinking of the climate crisis, I like to think of it as a double jeopardy. So when we're talking about low-income, historically marginalized folks, not only in the day-to-day are they facing a higher concentration of environmental hazards. So again, that's living near a toxic facility, a freeway, dumping sites that ultimately exacerbate health outcomes and shorten lifespans altogether. But at the same time, it is these same communities that are being most impacted by the climate crisis. Again, in the immediate impact of what we're seeing, we'll talk a little bit about the fires in Los Angeles, but also in the long term in terms of who is the last to recover economically. And so to bring it back to the impact on youth mental health, which is going to be the focus of this panel discussion, there is, I think, culturally a greater awareness in this moment about environmental racism, but that connection and that intersectionality with mental health is really left out of that conversation. And so experiencing environmental racism and climate injustice can really negatively impact mental health outcomes of children, adolescents. It can increase substance use concerns, and it also can lead to a different slew of academic challenges like absenteeism and difficulty concentrating. And a lot of the kind of newer focus and research at this moment is really on climate change as a driver of eco-anxiety and stress, which we'll be talking about in the panel. And the majority of young people have felt some form of eco-anxiety or stress over climate change in their daily lives. And the majority of young people feel sad, anxious, powerless, and helpless over climate change and feel that the future is frightening. So all of this to really speak to kind of this present moment where young people are at in the context of the youth mental health crisis as it relates to the compounding effects of climate change and environmental racism. And so without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our amazing panelists for this mental health moment and really just conversation about environmental racism and youth mental health. So we have Matthew Mills, which Diana briefly introduced. Matthew is a lecturer at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte School of Social Work, and he serves as the director of the Race and Social Equity Academy. Residing in Concord, North Carolina, he earned both his BSW and MSW from UNC Charlotte. And beyond his professional roles, Matthew is a dedicated father and husband, as well as a community advocate focused on environmental justice. He has organized panels and webinars with Wells Fargo and has also delivered a TED Talk addressing generational changes and challenges in environmental justice and racism, aiming to inspire systemic change. So excited to have you, Matthew. And we also have Evangeline, who has earned a Bachelor's of Social Work with a minor in Africana Studies, also from the UNC at Charlotte, where she was a Martin Scholar, receiving a full ride scholarship for high-achieving low-income students. During her time at UNC, she received awards in recognition for her community work and leadership. Angel is currently pursuing a Master's of Public Administration at UNC Charlotte at Chapel Hill and serves as a research assistant and provides project management and facilitation support to address strategic challenges for various public sector organizations. So Vanessa, if you can take down the slides. Perfect. And so to jump right into this conversation and thinking about environmental racism really broadly as a form of community violence, ultimately impacting young people's mental health, if you can both speak to your experiences growing up in communities experiencing environmental racism and just how you think that may have impacted your mental health. And I'll go ahead by starting off with just a recent example. I think that all of us know and have seen with the fires in Los Angeles, which is where I grew up and my family still lives, and really tying it back to that mental health impact. So we're seeing obviously the immediate trauma of those who have lost their homes in these fires, but there's also a level of secondary trauma and collective grief of just watching your hometown be devastated in the way that it is, and just having loved ones lose their homes as well. And then peeling it back kind of a third layer, there's this level of intergenerational trauma specific to the communities that have been impacted both in the immediate and also are going to be dealing with that long-term recovery. So to give an example, we have LA, there's not just the wealthy enclaves in West Los Angeles with the celebrities, but you have places like Altadena, which is a historically Black and Latino community. And so for Altadena in particular, you had Black communities fleeing the South during the Great Migration, settling in one of the only places in Los Angeles that was kind of exempt from redlining, not sure how, but it was. And that's really when you began to see Black homeownership, the accumulation of that intergenerational wealth, and just that level of trauma, right? Today, you're seeing that wealth really being stripped away in the form of losing your home basically overnight. So I'll pause there, but if Matthew, you want to go ahead and start again, just speaking to just childhood experiences and what that was like in relation to mental health.
Yeah. I know. Thank you, Leslie. I appreciate one, again, the invite for being here, as well as just that great level setting to what we're looking at when we see environmental justice and racism as a totality, right? I really want to hone in, especially for those practitioners here. Hopefully, everyone's hearing me and clearing up pretty well here. When we're looking at this concept of community violence, right? That's a really strong point that we need to better understand. One part being not just because of the conditions that we're seeing, but when we're looking at community violence, we're not just looking at the direct things that are happening that might be physically related to fights, shootings. Like we're used to hearing marginalized communities and these impacted communities having these adverse or bringing these into adverse type of environments. But when we're looking at community violence at the environmental racist or environmental justice level, we're also looking at the conditions that were forced upon communities. So I think Altadena, unfortunately, is a great example of a community that had to fight to get to the existence of being this incorporated space in California, like not just, right? So I want to make sure, myself coming from North Carolina, and we're talking about California, we're not just talking about two very limited specific examples, but examples that are historically relevant across the country, of these communities that were built to be what they are, to be areas without access to resources. When we're looking at environmental justice impacted communities, we're looking at what looks very similar to impoverished communities with lack of access to resources like transportation, limited access to schools that can provide for the best resources, right? Communities who their lack of access isn't because of what they are or who they are, but because they were built based off of policies that created these enclaves of environments that just were not built to sustain people for their best abilities, right? That's the community violence we're talking about. And that can lead to and support other types of violence, but we have to make sure we're looking at not just the experiences that people have, but also the conditions that brought this in. I like to break down community violence to this level of think of what could hurt you, right? Think of something that could hurt you and cause you levels of harm. What about those conditions being visited upon you because of the air quality? An individual with asthma, not because generationally or necessarily they would have had that if they were in a cleaner environment, but an environment that was built around an ecosystem of waste, an ecosystem of PCBs, an ecosystem that was built around manufacturing and other environmental conditions that limits their ability to live a healthier life. That's what we're talking about here. So that conversation of redlining is very important of community violence when we're looking at this environmental justice conversation, right? And California is an unfortunate reminder currently happening. And similar to North Carolina, when we look at the unfortunate ramifications of the hurricanes that came through that demolished Western North Carolina. We're looking at situations where people were forced into spaces and positions and now are going to have revisited trauma based off of not just where they were, because maybe you were great before this fires, maybe you were great before the hurricanes, but what took your families or these families time to grow into is now going to double up on because our environments did not necessarily naturally allow them to be. They had to fight for it. They had to scratch for it. They had to have the visibility kind of forced upon the world around them, right? So making sure that we're capturing community violence as a space of what happened to someone, but not happened to them because someone just punched you in the face, but because of a policy that was created long before you even had a chance to have a voice in the world that you live in, right? That is where many people are experiencing right now, right? And I'm kind of bringing that back to myself. I remember way back when I was in when I had having asthma. This is going through bronchitis and everything else back in the day, right? Having that happened to me. And being in middle school, and we would have those PE classes, for those who remember having physical education, you gotta go do those laps around the track and everything else. And it was the worst time for me, right? I could barely finish. It was a struggle for me when we were unfortunately that statistical family in North Carolina that had limited access to food resources and everything else. So I did not have a very healthy life coming up. So when that hit and it was diagnosed, and now I have to go do this track, oftentimes my mom would have to write me notes and letters to excuse me from having to participate in that, right? It was embarrassing, right? It was embarrassing to not be able to take part into it, to have this note that was giving in front of the PE teacher to everyone else. It was an experience that I didn't appreciate or didn't want, but I also couldn't change, right? It isn't necessarily the part of having asthma that caused the problem. It was the environment that I lived in that did not have much access to green spaces, didn't have much access to walking spaces. And granted, we did have to walk to get everywhere because we had lacking transportation in Concord, but that was also naturally, well, it was built into the environment prior to my existence in the environment, right? I could do nothing about it to change it. All I could do was to adapt to it as best I could possibly, as well as my family. This part is important to the conversation of environmental justice because right now, where I lived at the time doesn't exist anymore. What exists is a gentrified area that has access to walkways, has access to sidewalks, has access to single family homes, has access to transportation, has access to all the things that could have helped me, if not overcome my asthma, but could have helped me overcome my lack of connection to my environment. When we look at these environmentally justice impacted communities, what we often see is a lack of connection to them because of the limited resources that are available in those communities, right? But community members have to adjust to what they have offered to them. So having an environmental space, regardless of your health conditions, natural, genetic, or caused by the conditions around you, having an environment that helps support your ability to grow past that is greatly important. And the more that we have those conditions, the more individuals are able to overcome the hopelessness, overcome the embarrassment, overcome those possible structural impacts that we otherwise would just have to deal with and say, well, you know what, I got nothing. I don't have access to city council because I can't get there because we got to work. I don't have to worry about what my family had to get through to get here because here we are, right? A lot of communities have to deal with not just what's current to them in this moment, but also generationally what had to be fought for to get access to. So it's important to remember for providers, practitioners, individuals who are in this space working with youth to understand it's not just about where your client may be, that child might be, that youth might be right now, but what brought the community to be in this space and what happened to get them there. Was it a fight, or did you naturally have a voice because your community provided access to? Those that have access to that vocal space typically have a greater chance of being able just to be present and change within the communities. For those who have to fight and have to overcome, we still have those same stipulations of work and the other things that can limit our ability to impact our direct community and have to also strive for trying to create a better circumstance for our families as well, right? So all of that is encompassed in this community violence space, right? There's a great argument for, unfortunately, the visuals of these communities are often kind of placated to be violent, impoverished. They're products of their circumstances of what's available to them. Try to work on making sure we see them not for what's there right now, but how did it get there? How did you get access to, how did you get access to resources, or why don't you have access to certain resources as well?
Right. Thank you so much, Matthew, for starting us off and just offering such a breadth and wealth of experience and knowledge. And I think that quote of the conditions forced upon communities really stuck out to me of, you're not able to just up and leave. These communities oftentimes settle in very specific neighborhoods that were redlined, oftentimes because those were the only affordable neighborhoods. They're often next to toxic sites, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that really paints such a vivid picture. And I'll turn it over to Angel as well, if you can speak to a little bit about your experience growing up as well, and kind of that connection to mental health.
Yes, thank you. So my experience with both like the mental health impact and just the concept of kind of the environmental piece has definitely changed throughout my life. I don't remember a time in my life where I haven't had kind of concerns of the environment and stuff, even if at the time I didn't have the words for it, or I didn't really understand the systemic pieces, the roles that the other systems played in it until I got older. So definitely that conditions forced upon communities. I myself have lived experience of growing up. I didn't know that this wasn't common for everyone, but I recall that if we put our tap water in a cup, it would be kind of cloudy. It was like almost like a grayish color. And if you let the water sit for a little while, you'd watch it separate. And so that was something we knew, that the water we couldn't really drink because there was stuff in the water, because it wasn't safe. And so we were forced to drink buy bottled water, which was an additional cost for us and was often a challenge at times. But by that point, we're already having conversations of limiting plastics, things like that, and understanding that, we shouldn't be buying plastic water. You should be using tap. It's better for the environment. Well, when my environment is already unsafe, that isn't an option for me. As I got older, I started learning more about kind of PFAS and stuff. And I remember when I was younger hearing about, at some point they found out that there was something bad in the water, that the water was unsafe to drink. And it became this whole thing, lawsuits type stuff. And it wasn't until actually a few months ago when I started learning about PFAS that it clicked. And I looked it up, and sure enough, that was what was in the water. And that is what I grew up drinking, because at times we couldn't always have the bottled water. We tried, but there were times where I still did have to drink it, and was still using that water. And so I also want to highlight that bottled water piece, because I'm going to come back to that. But like knowing that that was what I grew up in, and mentally, it's like, I still don't know the implications of that. I know that throughout my life, I have things in my body that I'm unaware of, and that's going to have an impact on my health, things of that. And it was in a situation that I wasn't in control of. Similarly, something else I remembered as we talk about these red linings and safety in communities, something else that I grew up around that's even worse was the whole area's sewage water was a lake. So there was a whole section of where I lived that you had to avoid driving through, or if you did, you had to be careful breathing it in, because it was the worst thing you can imagine smell wise and things like that. And like, to something I hadn't even thought of is like, what was the impact of literally breathing in sewage water? That was what was used to water things that was there, and that was right down the street. And what is the impact of that? So I get to live with not knowing what the impact of my environment is going to be throughout my life. When I moved to North Carolina, again, with that environment always being at the forefront, I already knew that it was kind of my responsibility, or had to be a part of the efforts to quote unquote fix the environment. So even as a kid, adolescent, and teen, I was always involved in cleanups and other environmental things and movements, recycling efforts. I'm even a registered beekeeper, which I actually don't think we brought up before, but that was something to the extent that I was involved in, because it felt like my responsibility to be involved in those efforts. So that impact has followed me throughout my life. And going back to that mental health piece, through my efforts, to this day, I refuse to drink tap water unless I know it's filtered. I know it's been there, and I can see that it's safe. Even though all of my environmental efforts and stuff, and in like situations that led me to that, I've had people who've called me out if they see me with a plastic water bottle. Why are you drinking plastic water? You know that that's not good. Why you should be limiting your plastics, and not understanding why I'm in that situation, because they're like, well, the tap water's safe. Well, no, I've been told that before, and I can't trust the water. And so knowing that those implications, even as a child, is going to stay with me throughout my life. And then kind of being told that what I've done for the environment is not quote unquote good enough because it doesn't look like what other people have done. lower income individuals, I find, do not receive credit for doing, reduce, reuse, recycle, things like that, because it's the nature of our situation. If you recycle something in the name of environmental consciousness, you get credit for it. Look at you, you're doing great. But if I recycle because I can't afford to do otherwise, well, that just doesn't count. And so I also see, related to that water bottle piece, it's like, we couldn't put the upfront cost to buy these fancy water bottles to do the, have that or things like that, because we're already doing the most that we can. We're not getting credit for utilizing public transportation because we can't afford to purchase a car, drive a car, but we are doing that. We're not getting credit for not using our heater when it's snowing outside, or having AC when it's 120 degrees outside, because we can't afford to do so. And we are, by a byproduct, limiting our energy, but we are not getting credit for that. And so the last thing I want to touch on is, as I became an adult and being able to go to college, and it's something kind of like a whiplash factor, whereas leaving those environments and going to more affluent communities, there's essentially this guilt and anxiety, again, kind of being told that what I'm doing environmentally is not good enough, and being told that because what you're doing doesn't look like this, it's not the same, it doesn't count. I didn't have a car, I couldn't afford a car up until very recently, and I only relied on walking, taking the light rail, taking buses and public transportation. But again, that doesn't count because you didn't buy these nice things that to us are kind of, that is what environmental, protection looks like. And so it can be very othering, and it has that sense of guilt and anxiety, because I do so much for the community, for the environment, and want to leave the world a better place. But then due to a financial situation, I can only do so much. So just to kind of overview, I know I just threw a lot out, but again, having lived experience and that direct impact of what environmental racism does create a stress of what is and what's next. And kind of having that burden of having to fix a world that I did not create, and still having that desire to fix it, but there are limitations on impact due to where I came from and who I am, and I'm still coming up in the world, and having that idea that no matter how much I do or what I do, that idea that it's just not enough. So that's what I had to start.
Yes. Oh, an amazing start. And I wish we could take everyone off a webinar so everyone could applaud you, and just bravery and vulnerability and sharing your life experiences. I know this isn't just a statistic. This isn't just a hypothetical conversation. These are real lives and people and communities that are being impacted day to day by this. And I think what you spoke to specific, there's so many things, but that point of that onus being on individuals. So the whole reduce, reuse, recycle movement, very important, but that focus always being on individuals to kind of do their part, and not really taking in that broader community and systems level understanding and focus. And the whiplash factor, I mean, I think I resonate with that so deeply of, understanding that the communities I grew up and the things that I saw, and just the toxicity in the environment that I was living in because of factories, because of air pollution, was not normal. And we knew that, and we were told to stay inside, and like the fires, you're told to mask. But I think becoming older, getting that language to really be able to describe those experiences and see the communities you grew up in statistics and readings in college was a pretty, it's a pretty profound feeling. And it's hard to know, like, I don't know what the heck I just took in my whole life and what I was breathing in. So absolutely resonate with that. And I'll actually pop back to you, Angel, since I think this goes really nicely into our next kind of question, really surrounding the impacts of eco-anxiety and climate anxiety, specifically these feelings of distress about climate change, the effects of the environment and communities. And like you're saying, just this feeling of like not being able to do anything, or not being able to do a ton about it, but you're also inheriting this world where this is kind of the reality. So just curious if you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, happy to. And then I saw a question in the chat, so I dropped in there. I grew up in 29 Palms, and Lake Bandini was the name of the water. But yeah, so kind of touching on my last point again, we were given the planet as it is. And so there's a lot of anger and frustration for that, because then at the same time, again, we didn't create that situation, but we kind of had the burden of fixing it, these situations that we inherited. And I really don't like generalizations and try to resist as much as possible. But oftentimes we experience that, the youth are striving to fix it. And then the generations that created these situations often resist kind of fixing it. And we are ostracized for being environmentally conscious and kind of made fun of and dismissed. And it's like, oh, look at kids these days, and those kind of look at the, all their stuff and their new things to be worried about. And it's just like, well, we are worried about it. And we get to live with the impact of what others choose to do or choose not to do. And so that kind of forces us already at a young age to take charge and take action. Again, as looking back, it's so odd that I was doing all these cleanups and stuff and moving trash as a child, as a kid, when it's like, hold on, I know that a kid didn't put this here. An adult did, and yet I'm already having to do something about it. So we're having to take that charge. And I also feel like, especially Black and Brown individuals are oftentimes forced to take that charge because we see this more that as the climate impacts are affecting everybody, now it's becoming a bigger concern and more people are wanting to do something about it. This is becoming an issue. We're all starting to see the impacts, and now we need to fix it. Whereas Black and Brown individuals kind of have been experiencing this our whole lives for generations. And we were kind of left to figure it out on our own and didn't have the support of others, but now it's kind of up to us to not only fix our communities, but support the broader communities that now care, essentially. So as relating to what I talked about before, now that we see these conversations mainstream, which is a good thing, we do want more people caring about the environment. Again, we see ostracization of low-income individuals because we're being told that how we do it is not good enough, which again is weird when we've been doing this for generations. We're, again, reducing electricity, reducing that, reusing and recycling because of the nature of our situation. And then now being told, oh, but you should be doing this. And now that other people are in the conversation, there's now a new quote unquote correct way to do it. And some of it just isn't feasible. We're being told to pay more for longer lasting, more environmentally friendly products that just, there's a paywall, there's a barrier that we can't afford. We see it with the electric vehicle conversation. I'm sure a lot of people would love to have an electric vehicle, and we just can't take that step and can't afford to do so. We see a lot, unfortunately, right now with kind of the food and products that we use in our kitchen often, especially around like Teflon and non-stick. That's the newest thing that they're saying you should get rid of those, swap those out. Well, I can't afford to do that. That's a big investment up front. We see it with, plastic cutting boards and sponges, and there's microplastics as a result of utilizing those products, and then they need to be swapped for safer products. Again, I can't afford to do so. I already made that purchase, and I just have to deal with that. And that also creates a lot of uncertainty, again, about safety and that anxiety. I'm not a parent myself, but I can't imagine as a parent, if you're in these situations, being told, you go on the news one day and again being seen that your products you're using in your kitchen are unsafe, or you see another recall. The cheapest granola bars, there's foods and healthy foods that you can afford for your child are now being again recalled, and not knowing what is safe, or if I can't do anything to replace it, do I, if I don't have the money for food, do I swap it or get rid of these for the safety of my child, but then not have enough food? And so all those kind of uncertainties and that feeling of, again, in a different capacity of like not doing enough. Well, maybe I need to work more hours to get more pay to do this. And now I burn out and I have, the other stressors. And so everything kind of plays in together in that mental health piece and that added stress being in those situations. And I think another piece that's just kind of in the essentials, but another part is more of in the state of kind of consumerism and this idea, just because we're in these communities or lower income, we should still have access to fun things that bring us joy. And as we see in this age of kind of consumerism and social media, the challenges of things like fashion, which is typically not accessible, having the rise of fast fashion, which allows people who can't afford the nicer items and to look great to have those social media worthy outfits and those to be able to post and feel good about oneself, have the confidence of walking out being like, I look good, I feel good. Even if we're in these low income communities, we should be able to feel that and have those moments. But now we're seeing a rise of, attention to, which is valid, the attention of, here are the impacts of fast fashion. We need to do something about it, which I wholeheartedly agree. But then we see, for those who are low income, who can't afford fashion outside of anything outside of those, who the only ways they can afford is these cheap, environmentally harmful products, is then being told, again, kind of attacked for, why are you purchasing from these companies? Why are you doing that? You should be paying more for these more environmentally friendly brands. Well, that's just not feasible. So you have that kind of mental battle of, do I just not look good? Do I not feel my best? Do I not fit in to what society says I should look like or I should be like? Or do I know that I'm making choices that harm the environment and have long-lasting impacts? And that's a tough battle. And I know it sounds so easy to say, well, you should care about the environment more than how you look, but that's easier said than done. Again, when that social media is so prevalent, especially for younger individuals, especially in this day and age. And so that kind of, I don't know, damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of thing. And knowing that no matter what, you're going to have something else is going to be a struggle. So again, we kind of inherited this world. We have the burden of trying to convince people to help us save it. We get to see that people don't really care until it impacts them. And then once it does, they hijack the environmental conversation and tell us, this is how you should be making an impact. This is how you should do it. And essentially telling us that our ways isn't good enough. And all of that together increases the stress and, creates this idea that I can't even afford to not only meet my needs and pay my bills, but I can't even afford to invest in the environment and to the, future generations, which essentially just kind of creates a sense of hopelessness at times.
Yes, thank you so much, Angel. And I think you bring up such an important point of almost this like damned if you do, damned if you don't, this delayed response of like, well, you should be doing this or you shouldn't be doing this. And at the same time, sort of this co-opting that low-income BIPOC folks have had to do for generations to survive in the conditions that you were given, as well as the economic barriers. I mean, you should be getting this new pot, you should get rid of this thing. And it makes you think like, well, are any of my products safe? It's always coming out years down the line that this thing is toxic, you should toss this and all of that. So I think that's an incredibly important point. And I'll actually switch over to you, Matthew. We're going to shift a little bit to talking about sort of the clinical piece of this, and your role as a mental health clinician, Matthew, I think will be invaluable for this. And really building off the work, particularly of Black scholars like Dr. Beverly Wright, who has been pioneering in the research field of just that intersection, again, between environmental and health inequities, and really thinking through how practitioners and scholars today can better collect data related to sort of these macro environmental factors we've been talking about to better inform existing tools such as the DSM-5. So I will hand that off to you, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. So Angel really, I think, set up a great visual of what that looks like now, just to exist in this world that says, all right, so it's not only your responsibility to, excuse me, to fix what and where you are, but also fit into all those other normal or those other social norms that we have as well, right? So for this, don't think that what we're trying to provide is not intentionally a heavy lift, right? There are portions of what we're talking about and what I'm going to go into that are, of course, a heavy lift because we're talking about, and I've seen, thankfully in the chat, seeing where folks are coming from, a lot of social workers, a lot of social practitioners, a lot of folks who are embedded, whose work is embedded in the community. Yeah, it's a lift to change the way that we practice, but know that the work that we do is one of those few fields that the practice changes based off of what we do, right? So try not to hold on to the apathy possibly of, well, just the way it is the way it has to be. We can create those new norms as well, right? So when we're looking at Dr. Beverly Wright, who has this great a great model of the community university model, right? So if we're looking at that balance between the academic, the community, and the environment, the non-threatening environment, right? Bridging that in to be able to create a better environment to work in this environmental space, right? It's really important that we understand the ways that we can do that. If we're looking at those social norms that are expected, right? Our ability to participate at the very least in our norms in school. So go back to, and I'll use my own experience of interning at a local middle school in Charlotte, North Carolina, and seeing the limitations that these kids had to what they could do for school. Like it's either you can participate in a sport, but that was it for the extent for extracurricular activities, right? We did attempt to, at one point, try to create a community garden where individuals were able to stay after school, start planting gardens for fruits and vegetables, to be able to support the environment and also increase their knowledge and understanding of, hey, here's what you can do and what you might be able to do based off of where you live. One student had mentioned at the time that they actually did have a small garden in their house, but they lived in an apartment. So the garden that they had was in the windowsill that was able to grow some small tomatoes, right? This was the extent to where they were able to access some of the environmental conditions in their area, but it was important to them, right? It was one of the few times for this specific student where I was able to see them kind of grow and actually connect into and be a part of this school venture. The unfortunate part for them was their ability to participate was based off of could they have someone pick them up from school. Where they were at school was also depending on the bus route. Now, not so much the distance to their home, but the bus route that they required to have to go out to school might have taken them about 2 hours to get home, right? So school let out around 3 o'clock. They're not getting home until 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So the ability for them to participate depended upon transportation from their parent, as well as what time is this thing going to happen so that we might be able to actually partake in it. The struggle that we would see with kids at the time was a mixture, right? It was a mixture of, if we're seeing the environmental conditions, what they have access to, what they're able to be a part of. Thinking back to, excuse me, as Angel was saying, this transportation component, right? These things of what does my community provide for me, and what do I have to kind of stretch out further and further and further just to make sure I can make ends meet. Depending on what that looked like for these students, also played a part in what behaviors we saw with them as far as in their schools. We would see sometimes those adverse behaviors where we see students who would just struggle to get through. We might see behaviors that might be problematic to the school when it came to behaviors that could cause them to be suspended or something along those lines, right? What I don't want to do is kind of create this conversation that says students who live in these conditions are going to do these things, but they were often overlapped. What was missed was what the environment did not provide for them. So when we've sent students to counselors, sent them to therapists, sent them to school-based therapists within the area, what they would often diagnose them off of, or what they would look at would just be the conditions, right? So what happened that brought you here? Little Johnny, as we often say, did this, right? This student did this thing, therefore here we are, here's a referral to you to be able to engage in some type of therapy to reduce this type of behavior. The problem with that mentality is, one, it doesn't increase access for the student to be vocal, right? It does not give them access to be able to speak on their space, speak where they come from, and also understand what's the community environment to them. It also just does not emphasize the student's voice or the youth's voice to be able to speak on their conditions as they see them themselves. What we often find when it comes to environmental work and as it relates to an individual's ability to seek mental health usage is we just don't have a connection there, right? What the DSM-5, as was mentioned, when we look at those criteria and those diagnosis criteria, you will see environment, but the environment is relationships. The environment is more related to those direct bonds that we have with the people and the spaces around us, not so much the literal environment, the thing that gives us the resources that we have. So if we overlook that just by circumstance of we just don't ask the question, what invariably can happen is we just miss a huge gap of let's talk about something that impacts you that otherwise we might not notice, right? So yes, right now you're coming in and saying you love this thing that you can do, but you can only do it if your parent can get you up from school. They can't pick you up from school because they have to work. Now you have a possible conflict and this possible power dynamic that is inserted just because you want to do something that the environment says, you know, you can't do that. They live too far away. They work too far away. These issues compound inherently our mental health. They compound inherently our ability to connect with our environment. And when we have those compounded factors, what we're going to do is either we're going to wind up missing something that's important that someone could be empowered to possibly try to change, or we're going to lump some folks into a box of saying, well, this is what it's going to look like for you. This is your future. This is what's going to look like. As practitioners, we have to use the tools that we have to be able to work with clients, but we can't miss the fact that we can also inform those tools better. We can inform the research. We can inform our community of practitioners, clinicians, health and human service workers to be able to understand, hey, this environment also is one that just doesn't have access for students to accept or utilize other resources besides one type of thing. If it's just sports and you're not in the sports, that means you're going to go to school likely to participate in an environment that gives you nothing else to give back to it. If we don't have something to connect to our environments with directly that can help us feel either uplifted or that we can impact it positively, we likely become apathetic to where we are. And where I am is just where I am, and I can't do anything else about it. So being able to work with individuals, youth, communities, and impact them, as Angel was mentioning, acknowledge, yeah, what you're doing by stretching those resources, by using those plastic bags as trash cans, that's inherently what every corporation wants you to do when they're trying to check off those boxes of environmentalism. We want to make sure we can use things as long as possible. Unfortunately, you're naturally inclined to just use things in a way that can hopefully stretch them out more so. You won't get that ability to get that checkbox of saying you did great for it, but we have to understand there are many individuals who want to participate in this conversation of environmentalism and are likely doing more than some of their more affluent counterparts, but we just don't give them the acknowledgement of going, yeah, you're already doing it. You also can't produce as much waste and as much impact as those other affluent individuals in it as well, right? So making sure that we can use the tools, ask the questions, and put people in less of a box and give them more of an ability to speak on the conditions that are around them can greatly help impact the work that we do with youth, but also as well acknowledge just the things that are being done on a regular basis that are important and very highly positively impactful to the environment as well.
Absolutely. And just the importance of listening to our youth. We have somebody like Angel who is very clearly and profoundly speaking about her experience. And this is the day-to-day, this is reality. And I think just that ties into always the importance. We're talking about trauma-informed care, culture-informed care, this broader social determinants of mental health lens, and not only seeing kind of those downstream behavioral outcomes, but and just avoiding that pathologizing of behaviors that are really normal and natural responses to the environments that our young people are growing up and experiencing and living in. And so to that, I will actually switch to Angel and thinking about when we're talking about mental health providers supporting young people who are embodying and living with these impacts in their day-to-day. How can mental health providers support them? And Matthew, I'll ask you the same question, but just kind of incorporating a little bit of that restorative justice lens. So Angel, if you want to start.
For sure. Before I do, just something about when Mills was talking that reminded me of something else we used to do growing up. Again, talking about not quite getting credit for it. I don't know if this is as much of a thing these days, but getting cans, like soda cans and anything like that. We used to always collect those to sell them for, there was a place where we could take them and get money for it. And I used to remember like my parents would always be, if we saw cans on the side of the road or, things out there, they'd be like, go get those. And so it was like cleaning up and doing things like that to collect cans and recycling aluminum cans and other aluminum products. But again, in terms of that credit piece, it's like, yeah, we were doing it for the environment, but we were doing it for money and stuff. So it's just something I remembered as he was talking. When it comes to the mental health providers and things to kind of remember, especially working with anyone in these situations, but youth as well, is I think in general, just being aware of kind of what's going on, being aware of what is the environmental kind of situation of that community. Are there areas, are they near a highway? Are they near these kind of water things? Are there, a dump or something nearby? And just kind of knowing that situation and knowing that there could be impacts as a result of that. Being informed and listening to those who live there and kind of, again, keeping that in mind that that's an option. So when people say something like, Mills was mentioning, it's like, I have asthma or I have it, and knowing that they live in these communities and being able to see those connections and going, oh, that might not just writing off, oh, it's a genetic thing, oh, it's just a health thing, and being like, wait, there might be more to the picture. And of course, not just jumping and assuming everything is tied to it, but being aware that that's a possibility and knowing what are the broader implications of that. Because could there be other mental components tied to the fact that they live in a community like this outside of just the I struggle with this because of my breathing challenges and my asthma and things like that. I think it's also important to kind of be aware of resources and being able to connect people to that. And so not just hearing about it and being like, if they're talking about it, okay, why don't you look at kind of this resource to kind of aid with that and being able to kind of take a more holistic approach. Another thing which is I think is helpful is when we have those kind of assessments and stuff, and I'm sure Mills could probably touch a little more on this, having that, really taking that kind of biopsychosocial approach, and don't just stop it when you're having those assessments. Like, do you go to the doctor, and being like, okay, well, that's what we know for health, and kind of digging a little deeper. And even as, the focus on the mental health, but kind of knowing the physical components of their community and what's impacted them, and kind of knowing that health and mental health are related, again, especially when those health challenges arise due to kind of where they live, and the environmental components of it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Angel. And I'm seeing a comment of just what you were saying in relation to stigma, right? There is stigma in doing, quote unquote, these activities that low-income communities have done just in their day-to-day because they've had to stretch resources. Absolutely. And I think, Matthew, if you can speak to sort of what mental health practitioners can do in normalizing these conversations, and again, just incorporating that restorative justice lens with that.
Yeah. So this part, right? So this is, if I have nothing else to give you, and I hope that this message that we've all delivered has been that's been captured for you. If we're looking at restorative justice, and for those unfamiliar with it, at the very least, understand that restorative justice is a way to better connect to our community, to hopefully resolve other conditions and issues. Often this is looking at community. This is often looking in a space of justice related, right? So individuals involved in crimes or those types of issues. But this restorative environmental justice piece works the exact same way, where we're able to better connect to our environment and hopefully mitigate some of those other conditions. If we're looking at the stigma, if we're looking at the access, practitioners, wherever you are, whatever you do, we're also a part of these communities, right? That's really easily missed or otherwise somehow or another misinterpreted. Any of the work that we do, we always understand that our bias comes second. Our bias is not what drives us. Our ability to understand, listen, and create change. So the work that we're doing hopefully shouldn't sound too abnormal, or at least different. The work that we should be doing to try to create change creates a better power balance, right? Going back to the assessment, clinicians, individuals who do biopsychosocial diagnostic assessments, oftentimes we create those diagnostic assessments, or at least we can support the skeleton that's given to us. Asking the question of how do you connect to your environment? What do you think about your environment? Something related to helping someone tell their story better. Giving the youth especially a better voice to be able to speak on how their environment impacts them can help to acknowledge and give this kind of adjacent to environmental justice conversation where you can speak out loud openly to someone who can hear you, right? And as we can, because we can't change their environments, we can't change our clients' environments, we can help make sure they're aware of those conditions. We can hopefully, if we're also in those spaces, because some of us work in those environments, we live there, we're housed there, some of us are outside of. But the more we can connect to the environment, give someone a voice to be able to speak on their conditions. And I cannot overemphasize how often clients, especially youth clients, don't come to us because of their own choice. They're forced in there either by a referral for someone else, referral for something different. If we can give them a strong voice to be able to speak on their world, as Angel mentioned, this is their world. This is the world they have and are inheriting, and we're telling them you got to do different. We're kind of giving them stipulations to what they have to do, but we're not giving them the vocal tools to be able to grow, right? That doesn't mean dismiss what brought them to your services. It does mean hear them out. So the more that we can hear individuals out, the more we can add to the conversation related to our diagnostic tools. We have CEUs, we have all sorts of meetings and meetups that we talk about these. Bring directly this environmental conversation to those spaces. That doesn't mean you need another degree. It does just mean learn, listen, and know. The more we can do that, the more we can help individuals like Angel and whoever else might be inheriting what we are leaving them have a better chance of being able to grow in the environment and create a better space than what we've left them to begin with.
Absolutely. And Matthew, I think that is it, right? It's just, you're having people, like you said, not always coming to you by choice and empowering them to speak about their world. And I think that goes really nicely into what Angel has been speaking about of, we might not have the language to describe what is happening in our communities. You might be aware of it, but not quite yet be able to articulate that reality. And I think for a lot of us, that has come much later in life. That's come through higher education, unfortunately, but really being able to empower them and support them in that space, giving them the language, giving them the tools to kind of make sense of what they're experiencing, I think is really critical. And I will end this last question as we're wrapping up with Angel. And just for you, Angel, having experienced this, being your lived experience, I'm really curious what community care looks like for you, specifically as a mental health tool and also as a coping strategy for dealing with these mental health impacts as it relates to environmental racism and climate change.
Yeah, I definitely just think that, kind of approaching this with a really going off of what Mills was talking about, like intentional community responsiveness, essentially. Be aware that this is going on, support us, provide space for us to voice these concerns and, listen to us and hear us, but also, as Mills also said, being aware that you all do live here too. And so if feasible, taking some of the burden away from us if possible. Be in the communities, advocate if possible, and if nothing else, at least being aware of what's going on at the local level, state level, so on and forth. And also being willing to meet us and meet people in general where they are. As Juliana's dropped in the chat, is a great way of touching on, kind of what I was saying, was knowing that environmental, cleanups and things like that, it looks different for different groups. And so rather than putting on this kind of, it must be this to be impactful, knowing it looks different and meeting us where we are and knowing that we're all doing our part in different ways, if that's, what we're trying to do. I think it's also just important to know that, again, due to these systemic barriers and challenges, there is an existence of distrust. There are obstacles. And again, kind of creating space to tackle it, having conversations like this, but also have people ready to do the work, and knowing that there are people of different generations, a variety of ages and stuff, who are wanting to do the work. I know it can be challenging at times. And like I said, and I even said to myself, it can feel hopeless. But knowing that if we have a passion for it and a drive for it, others do as well. And so continuing to push for a change, and not kind of giving up and losing hope. And like I said, really just putting the community up front, having a variety of voices. And I think that there's opportunity to make a better future for the generations that follow.
Yes, and thank you so much, Angel. I want to be mindful of time too, but just to touch on that, I mean, really meeting people where they are, being humble and understanding that these youth are the experts in their experience, listen to them, ask them about it, and just kind of knowing when to take a step back, I think is really, really critical. And we wanted to share this as well for some additional resources. There's some amazing toolkits. We also linked in Matthew Mills's TED Talk in there as an additional resource, but just some extra information if you're looking on how to support your practice and also how to support youth that you're seeing who are experiencing this. If you can go, and then we have our references if anybody would like to refer back. All the studies that were referenced are in here, and as well as some upcoming CTAC events. So before we get to that, this recording, as Diana mentioned, and the slides will be posted to our CTAC website within 2 to 3 days of this event. And these are some of our upcoming events. So we have something on healing trauma in children with play therapy, treating family conflict and coercion with David Kolko, and understanding and addressing microaggressions in children's mental health services. So these are all on our website. But first, just want to close this by saying a tremendous thank you and lots of love to Matthew and Angel. I've seen a lot of applause and hearts coming into this space, and I think it just speaks to the timeliness and the need of this conversation as it continues to hopefully become more centered moving forward, again, of that intersection with mental health. And just thank you so, so much for speaking to your vulnerability and just showing up in the space the way that you do. So I think that is our last slide. Yep. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. And yeah, we will see you all soon.